Now, lastly, Jake Silverstein, editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine, to talk about fractured lands. Our collaboration on the landmark issue of the magazine this past August that includes Scott Anderson's 41,000-word story on the unraveling of the modern Middle East, Paolo Pellegrin's black and white photography, and a virtual reality video by Ben Solomon on the retaking of Fallujah this summer by the Iraqi army. And I'm pleased to say that Scott and Ben are both with us tonight. The success of our model depends on the willingness of news media organizations to collaborate with us. The Pulitzer Center isn't designed as a standalone news site. We very much want our work to appear in the world's leading outlets and with the editorial supervision from those outlets that guarantees reporting of the highest quality. Fractured Lands represents our largest single grant for a reporting project. It is a direct result of our efforts under the Catalyst Fund, launched just over a year ago with the aim of fostering strategic partnerships between the center and major news outlets. It was made possible by a 2-year commitment of $1 million from the MacArthur Foundation, the Candida Fund, and individual donors to the Pulitzer Center. The Catalyst Fund has facilitated some memorable reporting and collaborations with MSNBC on Matt Black's Geography of Poverty, with the New York Times OpDocs on Alexandria Bombach's video Afghanistan by Choice, with the New Yorker magazine on the upcoming project on refugees by Tomas Van Houtruf. We hope there'll be many more. And if they all have the impact of Fractured Lands, we will indeed change the world of journalism. Jake.
Thank you, John. First, let's just have a round of applause for Tomas and Anna, who are both tough acts to follow, but also, as well as them, so many other grantees are here tonight who have, just like them, done incredible work in a variety of outlets in a variety of countries all over the world for the past 10 years. It's a kind of an amazing room to be in. You can kind of feel it, and I know I can. So let's just have a round of applause for all those incredible... It's been an exciting afternoon and evening. John sort of teed this up very nicely, talking about the impact of this project. For those of you who still up there, yeah. Those of you who haven't seen it, just a quick overview of what it was, because it was a very unusual project for the New York Times Magazine. So this was the entire issue of the August 14th edition of the New York Times Magazine. It was one story by Scott Anderson, who's here tonight. Give him a round of applause, everybody. There's been a lot of applauding tonight, all of it merited. So Scott has been writing for the magazine for almost 20 years, maybe a little more than 20 years. Often, almost always, with his partner in crime, Paolo Pellegrin, a wonderful photographer, one of the really standout conflict photographers in the world right now, in my opinion. They often travel together and work together. Long before I came to the magazine as an editor, they were doing this. I think they've spanned 4 editors of the New York Times Magazine now. So I've had been, before coming to the magazine as editor, an admirer of their work. And this project was the biggest thing for the magazine that they'd ever done. It was a 40,000, well, actually, John, you said it was 41,000 words. It's actually 42,000 words. I've talked about this project a lot, as you might imagine. I've learned never to short Scott Anderson those last 1,000 words, or any writer. 42,000 words, which we believe, we can't confirm. It's very difficult to confirm something like this with the New York Times, with such a deep archive, but we believe it is the longest story in the history of the New York Times. Which, yeah, that's good. People are now just punchy to applaud anything. The story it unfolds the narrative of how the Arab world has sort of come apart over the last 5 years, over the last 15 years. We sort of initially began with an idea about the Arab Spring, and then we reached farther back in time. It tells that story through the eyes of 6 characters. There's a woman from Egypt, a young men both from Libya and Syria, an older man who's a Peshmerga fighter, a Kurdish Peshmerga fighter, and then 2 characters from Iraq. So you have 6 characters from different countries in the region, and you hear through their lives, but also kind of through the deep history that they are living. You get a sense, chronologically unfolding, of how all the upheavals that have sort of twisted apart the region over the last 15 years. And the piece also unfolds with Paolo's incredible photography. And Paolo, as I said, has been shooting the region for many, many years. And so we were able to reach back into Paolo's whole archive, 14 years of shooting in the region, and really tell a long and chronological story. We also, in addition to putting together this issue, which was, as I said, one whole issue with this one story, the only thing everything that would typically be in an edition of the New York Times Magazine was stripped out of it except for this story, with one exception, of course, because I'm not an idiot, which was the crossword puzzle. And then we also had a virtual reality film. A virtual reality film by Ben C. Solomon, who's here. Let's give him a round of applause. And Scott's piece essentially begins roughly in the early 1970s in Egypt, and it ends again in Egypt with his Egyptian character in April of 2016. That's the sort of last date in which his reporting ends. Ben's virtual reality film picks up in June of 2016 with the Battle for Fallujah. So the two pieces were very closely related, and Ben's film kind of gives you this sense, an ability to experience so much of what you're reading about in Scott's piece, all these years and years and years of battles throughout the region, whether they're happening in Syria or Iraq or Libya or wherever. Ben's piece allows you to kind of experience what that may have been like. So that's the final project, but I actually kind of want to cycle back and tell you a little bit about how this came about. And in telling you how it came about, give you a sense of why the Pulitzer Center was so important in getting us to the really ambitious final version of this that you see the cover of behind me. I think most of the people who are here tonight as grantees are writers, photographers, videographers. They're the people who get out there and do the reporting and produce the stories that editors like me publish. So I have a slightly different view of the process than a lot of the people here today, and than the people who've been speaking. And I think for a lot of people, the sense of editors and the sense of a magazine like New York Times Magazine is that we set out to do something, and we know from the very beginning exactly what we're going to do, and that is absolutely not the case. And often projects, just as they do for writers, just as they do for reporters, evolve dramatically from point A to point Z. And so I just want to tell you a little bit about how this project came out. It began in 2014, in the summer of 2014, when Paolo was in town visiting, and Scott and Paolo and I went out and had dinner. We ate some oysters. And we had, I recall, quite a few drinks as to wash down the oysters. And at a certain point began to dream of very audacious projects. At that point, it was 2014, we were thinking that the 5th anniversary of the Arab Spring was coming up and that we might do something big to commemorate it. And we recalled that there had been this edition of the New York Times Magazine when Obama was elected, and it was called, the cover line was Obama's People. The entire issue was just portraits of all of the incoming staff. I'm sure some of you remember of it, by Nadav Kander. It was a really stirring issue. There was one brief essay at the beginning. Other than that, it was pure photography. We were inspired by that. Let's do something where we would take over the whole issue of the magazine. And we were still thinking of it in somewhat photographic terms, and we thought we would do a heads of state project, all of the heads of state in the Middle East. And we would have photography by Paolo, and Scott would go and interview all of these leaders and ask them what the future held for their countries. So we, stumbled out into the night after our dinner, very excited about this project, and sure enough, went into the Times the next day and began to work on it. Getting the participation of these heads of state would, of course, be a many months long project, and so we began sending out letter after letter after letter to all of the different ambassadors. And His Excellency, please sit for this portrait or that portrait, and it began to kind of peter along. Now, the reason I want to start here is because, again, I want to just sort of note how a project evolves, and the idea that we initially had is very, very different from where we ended up. It took a tremendous amount of time to get there. And along the way, the project became much, much bigger. And I think thanks to Scott's and Paolo's insight, and Ben's as well, out in the field, much, much better and more interesting, more human, more nuanced, and more profound. But it took a lot of time to get there. And in the end, it was a much bigger project. Now, nowadays, giving reporters that amount of time, that kind of freedom to really sort of follow their nose and waste some time and kind of go down a path that doesn't work out and back up, it's rare. It's hard to find that kind of time. And it's essentially for two reasons. And there are two reasons that we've talked about a lot today. We've talked about in this hall tonight, but also during the panels earlier. Of course, the first is money, that time is money, as we all know. Particularly when you're talking about foreign reporting, particularly when you're talking about conflict reporting, which adds another layer of cost. News organizations just don't have the ability to commit the kind of resources that they once did to this sort of work. That's true for, if that's true for the New York Times, which I think it is. I think it's fair to say it is. I'm not, going to shy away from saying that it is. Then it's true for pretty much everybody out there. So time is money, and without a lot of money to support your time, you just can't send a writer like Scott out for as long as we had to figure out what the story actually was. And the next is that these kinds of projects, they run these kinds of very long projects, which is what this was. They sort of run against the grain of the kinds of work that is finding an easy and fast audience, and is also being assigned most in the current environment that we all read and write in. These are long projects. The time that it takes to actually have a result, to have something that you can publish, to have something that you can talk about, to have something that people can click on, the time it takes is quite long, and the payoff can sometimes take a long time to get there. That's a type of project that the appetite for has, I think, diminished, and that's a shame. And so these are the two reasons why I think this kind of project, this kind of large form project that we were working on here, is rare. At the magazine, we try to really focus on that because we see that that's a rare sort of project. We try to focus on these kind of big, long projects where we have a different sort of model and aim and purpose than the rest of the newspaper, obviously. We have our projects take longer, we come out less often, we have a sort of different type of staff with different skill sets. And one of the things that we like to really kind of focus on is these big, long, crazy projects that seem insurmountable at the start, but that if we have a lot of time, we can do. We sort of think of it as a kind of laboratory of audacity or something like that. On the 6th floor, that's what we hope to be. And one of the great examples of that was virtual reality. So this is a little detour from Fractured Lands, but I'm telling you, it does come back and it has a point. So as Scott and Paolo were out there roaming the world trying to get all these heads of state to agree to sit for their portrait, and none of them were agreeing. None of them wanted to be the first. That was the key. They would all say, well, who else has agreed, While that's happening, we were also beginning to get involved in virtual reality and figure out how we might make our first films and begin putting out an app that we were working on. This is in 2015. We eventually sent Ben on this is an earlier VR film, to do a film about the global refugee crisis. And we made a film called The Displaced, which showcased the worlds of 3 different kids, a Syrian girl, a South Sudanese boy, and a Ukrainian boy who'd been displaced from their countries, from their towns. And that film became our kind of the launch of the New York Times' virtual reality efforts. It was a big cover story in the magazine called The Displaced. A lot of fanfare, a lot of excitement about it. It was a really touching and powerfully transportive film that Ben made. That kind of represented in a lot of ways these sort of big, ungainly, multifaceted projects that we try to pioneer and really work on and focus on at the magazine. So meanwhile, as all of this is happening, as I said, Scott and Paolo are out there and they're coming back into the office periodically, or Scott is, and saying, this whole heads of state thing isn't really working out that well. First of all, the reality is that by the time we finish this project, these various heads of state are probably not going to be the heads of their state any longer. I mean, you see the way things are going. And also, they're not agreeing to talk to us, and we think we should shift gears. And so rather than focus on heads of state, we decided that we would focus on sort of average people in these various countries, the experiences that they had had, and we scaled it down so that we could really zero in on 6 characters. So Scott kind of wrapped his head around that. He already had some ideas about where he wanted to go. Ultimately, Scott would spend, I think, 5 months on a series of trips and throughout the region, getting to know these characters, getting to understand their lives, their families, where, you know, what had led to their experiences in the past, their parents, et cetera, and understand deeply what had happened in all of their lives. At the same time, we began to talk to the Pulitzer Center. So this was back in the end of 2015, I think beginning of 2016. And initially that conversation had to do with the virtual reality. This is where the 2 stories fuse. The Pulitzer Center had been really impressed and interested in what Ben had done with The Displaced, and was interested to see if we had more virtual reality projects in mind for the future that might take place overseas, that might involve some conflict reporting, that might kind of overlap with the mission of the center. And we said, absolutely. In fact, we have this big, giant, crazy project that we don't quite know exactly where it's going yet. And we laid out for John and others at the Pulitzer Center what exactly we were doing. We explained that Scott and Paolo had been out there reporting for, at that point, over a year, that they had zeroed in on these 6 characters, that we were going to take over the entire issue of the magazine, but that, to be honest, things were, you know, they were sort of at that point in any project where you had these great big ideas at the beginning, and their cold, you know, light of reality is starting to shine down on them. I had been confronted with the fact that the project that we were working on was relatively uncommercial, and that the idea of an entire magazine devoted to how the Middle East came apart over the last 5 years was not necessarily going to be tremendously appetizing to the various advertisers that might want to be a part of it. And that, in fact, because of that, it would be possible that no advertiser would want to be a part of this issue of the magazine, which would itself be sort of unprecedented, a dubious honor. So there was problems like that. There was also the problem that, you know, Scott is a contributing writer to the magazine. He's not on staff at the magazine. So, you know, Scott was at this point had spent over a year. In the end, it would be 18 months on this story. You know, the typical pay rate that we would pay for a story, the word rate that we would pay for a story, wasn't really going to kind of match up with what the amount of time that Scott was spending on this. It just, you know, this was not a normal story by any stretch of the imagination. And the same goes for Paolo as well. So, you know, all the problems that you kind of confront midway through a project were coming to a head, and they were bigger. They were magnified by the fact that everything in this project was bigger and magnified. And we still were very excited about it. We still had faith, but we were at that kind of moment where you start to go, well, maybe a 80% version would be just as good. And then along comes the Pulitzer Center, and John and everybody here. I mean, we quickly moved past the idea that we would simply collaborate on the VR piece that was going to be part of this, because as I said, we laid out the whole vision, and almost immediately I think John understood what the power of this project could be and how big it could end up being. I think he was excited as well by the idea that we would take over the entire issue of the magazine, that we would sort of command people's attention in this way. And so not only did they commit to funding the project in a way that would allow us to sort of to go back out into the field more, to, you know, help support Scott's efforts and Paolo's efforts out in the field, to put together the kind of team that we would need to make the VR film. But more than that, as a lot of people have said, there was just a sense of wind in the sails that went far beyond the financial support. There was a sense that these were shared partners, that these were people for us at the New York Times who we were talking to, who understood very well the journalistic goals and the challenges and the nature of the work that we were trying to do, and that we're real partners. And that, I mean, that's just incredibly rare. I can't really think of another partnership type situation I've been in where a granting organization seemed as truly much like a partner to the journalistic apparatus, and that was something that we really treasured. So at that point, we started to sprint toward the finish line, and sprint is the correct word. Pulitzer Center was also quite amazing with how willing they were to sort of like throw everything into, you know, put the pedal to the floor immediately and really try to get to the finish line. Scott and Paolo finished the story. We published it on August 14th. It was we did indeed, as I had suspected earlier the year, have very little advertising interest in being part of an issue like this, and so we made the decision, because we had the support of the Pulitzer Center behind what Scott and Paolo had done, to just offer no advertisements whatsoever in the magazine, to essentially present to readers what was a book. It was a book with a crossword puzzle in the back. Which, let's be honest, probably all books should have a crossword puzzle in the back, maybe. So the response to the piece, to the issue, has been absolutely tremendous. I mean, I could go on for much longer than you would want me to, talking about how excited people were about this. In the first week, I think it had around 3 million page views, which is tremendous for a story of any length, particularly one that's 42,000 words. We made a 42,000 word story on the collapse of the Arab world go viral, which was not what we expected necessarily. Ben's film, which was this incredibly tense and vivid and I think moving experience of what it is like to be in combat, what it is like to be on the ground in a city like Fallujah that is being retaken from ISIS. That's, of course, the story of so many cities in Iraq, and perhaps will be over the next, remainder of this year as well. It accompanied it very powerfully, and it also found a great audience. And I began to get letter after letter after letter, and email after email after email from longtime readers who would say things like, I had the feeling that all the journalism was going down the tubes in this country, but this is the sort of thing I've been waiting for, and do more of this. And I mean, I can't tell you how many letters I got that were from readers who felt that what this piece had done is what we had initially set out to do, and what we would not have been able to do without the Pulitzer Center, which is tell the kind of macro story, the large-scale national historical story of how these countries had fallen apart, but through the lens of individual human lives. And because the stories were told through the lens of individual human lives, which is, I think, one of Scott Anderson's great, unbelievable talents, the sort of humanism of his writing, his sympathy and empathy for human beings and what they go through. Because these people were brought so vividly to life, readers who maybe had begun to glaze over about stories about the Middle East, or who felt like they had already read enough to understand it and were going to move on. Those readers, they read these individual human accounts, and they just began to have a much deeper understanding of what's happened in this region, and a much, I think, more profound grasp of the tragedy. And again, that just would never have happened had the Pulitzer Center not come along and put the wind in our sails that it did. So I want to, and one last thing I would say too, before I begin to wind up, I am going to wind up, is that, and that now this whole story, this 42,000 word story, is now in classrooms. Scott has been, I don't know how many, but to a number of classrooms, some just this week. There's been 4,000 downloads of the lesson plan that the Pulitzer Center built. I believe Fareed told me earlier, where is Fareed? Yes, we should applaud Fareed. We should absolutely applaud Fareed. Fareed, who does incredible work with the educational matter that the Pulitzer Center puts out. We did a program at the Columbia Journalism School about a month ago, and there was this moment where Fareed was explaining all the stuff that is happening with fractured lands in classrooms, and literally the entire room of journalism students and journalists who had come just fell completely silent, myself included. My jaw was on the floor when he got to the end telling this incredible tale of all the different things that are being done with it. And people burst into applause when he was done talking about it. And they all felt like, I wish that had been my high school education. There is all this tremendous work being done in the classroom around this project now, all of it thanks to the Pulitzer Center, which to us is just unbelievably gratifying. As journalists, you often have a way of figuring out whether people are reading your stories, but you don't really necessarily have a way of figuring out whether they're learning anything from your stories, unless there are teachers grading them on whether they are or not. So that's very exciting for us. So I just want to close by saying that I think this is undoubtedly, this is a sort of new age of journalism that we're in. It's a challenged age. There are financial constraints on what we can do that are unlike any we've faced. in recent times, and it's hard. We have to be creative, and part of that creativity is in finding partners that you can work with to amplify what you're trying to do. That's true for everybody. It's true for small outfits. It's true for individual journalists. It's even true for the New York Times. So the Pulitzer Center just has an absolutely huge role to play in all of this. You can see what that role was in the story that I've told just now. You can see what the role was in the previous two speakers, obviously. You can see what the role has been for everybody who's here tonight. The forces that made the Pulitzer Center necessary 10 years ago and that have continued to make it necessary for the past decade, those forces aren't going away. Those forces, in fact, I think are going to get stronger and make what John and everybody at the Pulitzer Center has done over the last 10 years even more necessary. So I want to thank from the bottom of my heart everybody here tonight who has supported the Pulitzer Center, who works for the Pulitzer Center, who's made it possible for this organization to exist. I want to particularly highlight John. You know, they say fish rots from the head down. The opposite is also true. When an organization has as deep a heart and as incredible a mission as this one does, it comes from the top. And so I want to just give John... And I think that's the best note to end on. A round of applause for John and a round of applause for everybody who has made this organization possible. Thank you.